Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Good. Very well, thank you. And like to talk a little bit about the Middle East, of all places. We've been remaking the Middle East. I don't know if you've noticed.
Yeah,
I don't know whether anybody claims progress, but we're still at it. We've been working on Afghanistan for 16 years. And right now, if I were a betting person, I'd probably bet, unless we change policies, we're going to be there another 16 years with no victories to brag about. Of course, there are victories that they're bragging about, but it might be premature. You know, we're beating ISIS. We see that ISIS was thrown out of Raqqa and Mosul, and people are claiming victory, but I don't know if they're going to hold up the sign, mission accomplished yet or not, because there's still a lot of problems. But the subject today, of course, is bombing for peace. We have to, always fighting for peace. Everybody's for peace on their particular terms. But if you look at the statistics, things don't look too well. If you compare the people dying per month under Obama, they were a lot less than what's happening right now. They've escalated, and the bombing has escalated. And it looks like it's going to continue to escalate because there's no pretense that they've changed their policy. The only argument I see going on right now is the argument between the anti-terrorist groups. They use ISIS as the main reason why we're there. We have to defeat terrorism. And then the McCaneites and Graham, they say, we're just not anti-terrorists. We have to have a precise policy. And they object. They want a more clear-cut, expanded policy, much more like maybe Assad has to go and we have to really get busy and remake the Middle East. So there's lots going on now. The cards have definitely shifted since Raqqa has fallen and Mosul has fallen. But it just might change the cards in the deck a little bit and who has the clout. But there's still a lot of problems over there. And it looks like in this short period of time of the new administration, we're more involved than ever, and there's not much sign that is going to change.
You're talking about a long war in Afghanistan. When we went into Afghanistan, my son was wearing diapers as a baby. In less than 6 months, he'll be required to register for the draft. So here's a baby born, and now he may, who knows, go fight there.
Yeah.
I doubt it. But talk about a long war. But on McCain, in a sense, you are right, because we know what's on his mind when he says this. But in one way, and this is a rare occurrence, I agree with part of what he says. He's apparently withholding Senate approval of many of President Trump's nominees to the Pentagon until he has a more precise plan from the Pentagon, from the White House. What is your new strategy in Afghanistan? Because what you've told us so far doesn't tell us very much. And so our hats are off to him for that, except as you pointed out, what he wants the strategy to be is something very different than we would want it to be.
Right, and they have warned us. I don't think we should be shocked that this is happening. This is a Trump position. We would go any place that we see terrorists arrive. And yesterday we talked about why we're in Africa and how many countries we're in Africa. That goes along with his philosophy. So that will continue. They won't be backing on. But it looks like there's some escalation. And this, in some way, is a follow-through with a different technique of Obama, the good war, Afghanistan, and now Trump is doing this. And John Nicholson, who's the commander in Afghanistan, I thought he said something interesting about policy and weaponry. He says a tidal wave of Afghan air power is on the horizon, a tidal wave. I don't know. I'm sure you saw the report. Helicopter wars. I remember that so clearly because I was in the Air Force doing flight physicals for people who wanted to go and fly, and they were excited about flying helicopters in Vietnam. Of course, all I think back now is how many of those never came back. But, he was in Afghanistan celebrating, 2 Black Hawk helicopters. Wow, how many helicopters are they going to have? And the answer is,
159 new Blackhawks.
Wow, I wonder who makes Blackhawks. And Lockheed's wouldn't be involved in that, would they?
Our old friends Lockheed Martin.
I bet they make a couple dollars. I wonder what one Blackhawk costs. It costs plenty.
No, it's not cheap.
So, and that is hardly a sign of the end of the war. And they're fighting the Taliban. Yeah, the Talibans, they'll get discouraged and they'll give up. Because they always lose on the long run. No, they always win on the long run. They wear everybody else out. They just get another generation of young people to come up and they'll fight the war. And they have the sentiment of the homeland, protecting the homeland, and they're more homeland people than Al Qaeda. They're not out there trying to spread the boundaries of Afghanistan, but they will fight for their homeland, and they like their way of life. And I think history shows that there's been quite a few people try to take over Afghanistan, and it never works. So I don't think going and adapting the philosophy of helicopters being the solution. It didn't work in Vietnam very well, different terrain and all, but probably every bit as risky in Afghanistan with all those mountains and things. Before it was the jungles, but now they're going in with 159 helicopters to root out the Taliban. But my guess is that the Taliban will learn how to shoot them down. I mean, I think that there's weaponry around, and the people who like war and selling weapons, it seems like the enemies, there's a balance always there that we don't, and we use our enemies sometimes to fight our battles and pretend that we're fighting to beat us out, and yet we align ourselves with some bad people. It just goes on and on. And this is not the road to peace, and we're not likely to have peace come out of this. We're going to have more war and more killing. Statistics that we started off with are definitely on the side that there's a lot more civilian deaths, collateral damage they call it, in this administration than there was in the last.
And a lot of people who try to defend President Trump, even some libertarians will say, well, he's not starting any new wars. Well, technically not yet, he hasn't, but he's greatly expanded the scope, the aggressiveness of the existing wars. And I guess the intent is to wrap them up quickly. However, they're not wrapping up quickly. And here's, one of the reasons we called the show what we did today is this report from Air Wars, which is a very helpful site that catalogs deaths, civilian and military, from airstrikes in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. But they reported not too long ago that throughout the entire anti-ISIS operation, and that's from October 2014 until today, there have been a low-end estimate 5,100 civilian deaths. Probably about double that, but whatever the case. But 55% of those deaths have taken place during the first 6 months of Trump. So just in his first 6 months, he's had more civilian casualties than the entire period of the operation before that.
In a way, if you look at this superficially, somebody might be watching our program. What are these guys doing? Defending Obama? Hardly. We're talking about a different tactic, because Obama was still strategically on remaking the Middle East. I mean, he was still very much neoconish, involved in pursuing these wars. Because just remember, the one thing he said up front was, we're going to get out of Iraq. I think we're still there a bit. It's still our government. But the good war was Afghan war. And of course, it's been escalated, and they tried to do all kinds of things unsuccessfully. But he's the one that said Assad has to go. He's the one that got us up into Syria. And I think Hillary and the last administration had something to do with that mess they made in Libya.
Yeah.
And who knows, that might get stirred up again. But then also Obama and NATO and the Eastern Europeans were all together on a coup in getting in Ukraine. So and the sentiment changing to an a virulent type of anti-Russianism has occurred, which was a bit of surprise because that wasn't Trump's position.
Yeah.
So the policies are important, but it's always nice to say, well, at least there were less people killed. But even if we could continue bombing and we never lost an American life, but we didn't know why we were in there. There was no real purpose, and we killed and even won a victory by the killing from the air. That doesn't make it moral. It doesn't justify it, and certainly it's never constitutional, because these people, the Taliban hasn't marched on us. They're not about to attack us, and yet the people don't get to speak through their congressman and say, is this a war we're talking about? Is this a real war? And like yesterday, we talked about Africa. Most people don't know how much we're involved in. That's all transition, and it's not just this administration. It wasn't just Obama, but it's a steady transition, because that deep state and the military-industrial complex and policies very much controlled by people who can control both parties. Too much bipartisanship in foreign policy, for sure.
There's a great article by our great friend Jim Bovard in USA Today. I think it was yesterday, but it's on that exact point that, Trump is doing a lot of things, but guess what? He's inherited this idea of the imperial presidency from those before him. So I encourage our viewers to check out Bovard's great piece. And the other reason why there are more civilian deaths, and this is certainly a factor, is that there has been an increase in civilian warfare in this last 6 months. You had the U.S. assault on Raqqa, you had the U.S. assault on Mosul, and we even have a picture here of Mosul, if we can bring it up, of what this has resulted in, this large town. I mean, this is really kind of a heart-wrenching photo if you look at it. Wow. Here's a guy, this is where he lived, his family.
What a horror.
And this is really the whole city. So it's understandable that there are more civilian deaths, and also the reasons are the change in the rules of engagement, loosening of the restrictions on targeting civilians or allowing civilians to be caught up in it, more aggressive bombing runs. President Trump announced in September that he was giving more autonomy to the CIA to do drone strikes, restoring what Obama had slightly restricted. So there are a number of factors, but indeed they are going up.
Do you think that picture would represent, the saying, you got to destroy a village to save a village? Of course, it's easy to destroy the village. They do that, but I'm not so sure they really save anything, after all the killing and destruction.
He didn't look saved, that gentleman.
No, that's for sure. What our government has claimed drives our policy is counterterrorism, anti-ISIS, and that's the moral justification of it. Go wherever the Islamic radical terrorists are, and no matter what continent they're on, no matter what kind of authority has been given, we got to go get them. But now, on the surface, they're claiming that they've done such a great job. They've rooted them out of Raqqa and Mosul. So therefore, there's this possible strategy that they have to change their tune. And now, if we've defeated ISIS, how are we going to stay there unless we have a justification? And many are predicting, and I think it's very possible, because we've already heard it, and that is it's anti-Iran and anti-Hezbollah, and they are equivalent to all the bad guys that ever existed in the world. And of course, it's been easy to hate the Iranians, and yet statistically, and the people, and their relationship with the West, and their compatibility with Christianity, and even the Jewish community, you never hear any of that. But now, it seems like we're moving in this direction. I'm just wondering whether you have a thought on that, whether that is going to be able to be sold to the American people, that they got to really get geared up. Oh yeah, 16 years wasn't enough, but now we have to go and get Hezbollah and the other parts that are allies with Iran.
And that's really the second point we wanted to make in the show, is even after victory, the war continues. And that is the case definitely in Syria and in Iraq. And the U.S. is expanding its operations, if anything. What's interesting, though, is to watch is that with the sort of abandonment of the Kurds, with the U.S. and its allies turning against especially the Iraqi Kurds in their push for independence in the Battle of Kirkuk that we talked about a couple of days ago, how much are they going to be able to rely on their proxy fighters in Syria, which are vast majority of them are Kurds? At what point are the Kurds going to say, we have been double-crossed by the Americans? And if that's the case, there will be no American proxy forces in Syria to expand.
I don't know if you've noticed or agree that recently pronouncements from Russia has been quieter. And we've made the pronouncements, even the United States, claims they were the ones that were responsible for defeating ISIS, and there's a little bit more to the story, especially in Syria, because Russia had something to do with that too. But I just wonder, you know, if their strategy is now just sort of sit back and be quiet, because they haven't been, I guess the concentration against Russia has been this crazy stuff about Putin's support for getting Trump elected, which is a real stretch. But Russia must be paying close attention to this, but you don't hear about them sending in 159 helicopters to pick sides on this.
Here's what I'm reading about Russia, and I tend to believe there's something to this. You know, hear me out in this scenario. What I'm reading is that Russia is backing off. It wants out of Syria. It does not want to be part of this permanent force there. It's backing off, but it understands that the Israelis will not tolerate the Iranians there. The Israelis have made it very clear. They've been meeting with the Russians lately. What it sounds like is going to happen is that the Russians are going to pull back. They're going to do some things that will clip Iranian wings in Syria and force the Iranians to back off, to keep the Israelis from going bonkers and starting a larger war. That's what it seems like is happening. I think the Iranian influence may actually wane to a degree in Syria because of Russia's concern about a regional conflict.
Yeah, and we know where Israel stands, you know, with the Kurds, and they've already been involved more so than I had expected. And generally, they try to avoid that because they think this will, you know, unify all Arab countries and bring them together. But that could be a very ticklish situation because if indeed Russia does back off like that, then the danger exists there that it's not going to go smoothly. And unfortunately, from what we're reading now, is that there may be a new attack on Assad. Maybe we'll be all the way back to 2011. Assad has to go, and I wouldn't be surprised if deep down in Trump's heart, that's probably where his sentiments are. You know, they certainly are with the neocons, and we have pointed out and been disappointed with so much of the policies has drifted toward, you know, supporting a neoconservative position.
Yeah, and there are every indication that with ISIS being done for essentially in Syria, that the shift will happen. And I'll just tell you one final thing. Ambassador Robert Ford, who was U.S. ambassador, who really is the father of the Assad must go policy, he's the one as ambassador to Syria who recognized the rebels as a legitimate force, a legitimate government in Syria. He has a lot of blood on his hands. But here's what he said the other day. Now, i.e. after the ISIS focus is gone, the U.S. is going to, quote, have to be dealing, as much as they don't want to, with the politics of the Syrian civil war. It's just unavoidable now. So it is really back to 2011. So I would just, my final word would be, as Dr. Paul suggested earlier, we are back to square one. My final word is, don't forget the book offer only through the month of October. RonPaulInstitute.org. There's a hyperlink on our front page where you can get more details on how to get Ron Paul's new book.
Thank you, and I want to thank the audience for joining us today. And I think so often the excuse or the reason that we do get involved in many countries in the Middle East, and even yesterday when we were talking about Somalia, there's been civil strife and civil wars going on, and we have to go in and pick a side. We're almost obsessed with that, and I think this is very true. We got involved in Syria. There was a civil war going on. If the Syrians would have been allowed to deal with that on their own, I think if Obama had not said Assad has to go, we probably would have not seen Russia getting so much involved. And I also think the whole thing of the Middle East is a bit of a religious civil war going on with the Sunnis versus the Shia, and that involves Persian Shia as well. And those are difficult issues and a lot of disagreements. They've been around for centuries, many centuries for that matter. And for us to come and travel 6,000 miles away and get in there and think that we know what's best and how to solve this civil war, it's all going to be okay. I think if nothing else, these last 15, 17 years or even longer, matter of fact, you can go back to 1990, that our interference over there has not served us well. It's bankrupting our country. We have not brought peace and prosperity. What we brought are the pictures we saw today of Raqqa, the people just totally suffering with their villages and all their property destroyed. It's time for the American people to wake up, because I put the burden back on the American people, because the American people are supposed to, in a system like we have, a republic, you're supposed to be able to put pressure on the members of Congress to resist what a president does.